G'day groovers, rockers, and in between. This is Vinyl Vibes. I'm your host, Jack Hodgins. Today, we are talking with the former drummer of Dragon, Kerry Jacobson. Kerry joined Dragon in 1976 after the passing of original drummer Neil Storey. Kerry joined just as the band's fame was about to take off with the release of their third album, Sunshine. A year later, in 1977, the band would release its most well-known song, April Sun In Cuba, which to this very day is an Australian icon. Kerry would remain in the band for a few more years before leaving in 1983, shortly after the release of the band's single, Rain. He remained in music, however, and has worked for the likes of Mondo Rock, Richard Clapton, and Ian Moss. More recently, he has formed a new group called the Filthy Animals, which is playing parts of Queensland. G'day, Kerry, and welcome to Vinyl Vibes.
Thank you, Jack, and nice to be here. Nice to hear you.
Let's start off at the beginning, Kerry. You were born in 1954 in Wellington, New Zealand. Do you recall much about your childhood?
Yeah, of course I do. But, growing up and becoming a drummer and in my late teens and going through the music industry, there's some aspects I don't remember.
Yeah, I mean, what was some of the music you were listening to then, like growing up in Wellington?
Yeah, it's I've kind of had an interesting upbringing, I suppose. When I was about, very young, 7, 8, 9, when I was aware of music. And my dad was actually a cocktail pianist back home in Wellington, New Zealand. So I was kind of around music. He played a lot of jazz. And so that's kind of how I started playing along to jazz records. He had a little band that rehearsed on weekends in our lounge room. And so I think it was one day, I was always very interested in the drummers. One day the drummer just handed me a pair of brushes and put a piece of brown paper on a stool and said, "Here, do this, follow along." And I kind of got the bug from there. So, to cut a long story short, my roots are in jazz, always have been, and I guess always will be. So I always go back to that style to listen to relax to, and even to play sometimes. But then from there, of course, I just sort of developed into different styles, funk, rock, all sorts of other things. And I think a lot of the influence came from a lot of the Maori bands I was hanging around with when I was in my later teens back home, because they were obviously into they probably still are, into the funk. So it took me in a new direction. So I suppose that's a bit of a long-winded story, but that's kind of how it all happened. Did
the records of the mid-60s, or I mean, you mentioned jazz there, but did the records of the mid-60s or late 60s ever impact you, like the Beatles, the Who, anything like that?
Yeah, they did. But, I went from jazz, and then all my school buddies in high school were getting into Dark Side of the Moon and Hendrix and all those guys. But I was moving into fusion rock, I suppose, and funk, definitely all the Motown stuff, because they're the records I used to practice to. I used to love and still do, that hypnotic feel that those drummers and those songs had, particularly that Motown era. So, yeah, it took me a lot longer to move back into the absolute rock thing. And I suppose that came from Dragon and onwards. Dragon, I still injected that kind of funky style, I suppose, a bit of that. Then, of course, after that, more into the rock thing with people like Ian Moss and bands like that.
Yeah, and of course you mentioned your high school days there, and I'm just kind of thinking, when did your first group come along? Was that was it Mammal that was your first group? I was trying to do some reading. Yeah, tell me.
You've really done your research, Jack. Yeah, that would be right. That would be, I suppose, my first serious rockish group. They were kind of into the Tamla Motown thing, and incidentally, well, you probably know that had Robert Taylor in it as well at the same time before he joined Dragon. So he joined Dragon after that band broke up, and then they came to Australia. I think they were here for about a year, and then, of course, sadly, the original drummer passed away. That's how I got the gig, I suppose. I got the call to come over and join them, and, of course, then it went from there. We recorded the first album, and then boom, it kind of went off. But yes, Mammal was definitely my first, I suppose, serious band on that level. But I did start, when I was mucking around, rehearsing with my dad in the lounge room at a very young age. I did start to do gigs while I was still at school with him on Saturday nights, and was getting paid for them, doing little jazz kind of cocktail gigs. So that's really how I got started.
Yeah, and of course you mentioned there with Mammal how you got I think you got a telegram saying that, that the drummer Neil Storey had unfortunately accidentally passed away. I mean, they sent you an air ticket as well to come over to Australia. I mean, what was that moment like for you?
It was an interesting time. It was actually given to me. It was a telegram. It was given to me by Mammal's ex-manager. The telegram said, "Fame and fortune awaits." And there was an air ticket inside the envelope. So I packed up my drums, and in those days you could travel with your equipment. And I came to Sydney, and it was kind of scary but exciting. And landing in Sydney was just a whole new world. It was such a different city than Wellington, where I'd come from. It was an amazing experience. That would have been, I think, September 76, something like that. Fame and fortune didn't await. It took a little while. The band were living in a kind of boarding house in Edgecliff, which was pretty awful. They'd kind of had a lot of the songs written for Sunshine, but were still doing shitty little gigs in pubs and getting paid with a pile of mincemeat to feed the band, that kind of thing. And it wasn't until we got spotted by Sebastian Chase, who became our manager, and then Peter Dawkins, who was the producer at CBS Records, that we got signed and got to record the first album. And then, of course, it all changed. But that would have been quite a few months after I landed.
And of course, I mean, you mentioned there the differences between Sydney and Wellington, but I'm also thinking like the music scene between Australia and New Zealand at the time. We're talking 1976 here. Was there a big difference, or was it pretty similar?
A big difference, yeah. It's a good question. When I was in New Zealand, and I mentioned the Maori funk bands and my association with them, and they were always so open arms and giving, and yeah, come up and have a jam. And a lot of those drummers showed me actually how to, I kind of watched how they played. They had a different, because they were the funk thing. They were always into the funk and the soul, and the disco thing was huge then. And when I came to Australia and started going to places like the Bondi Lifesaver and all those iconic venues where all the bands play, I noticed there was more of a closed shop when, no one was really, bands weren't as encouraging for you to get up and have a play. Interesting, because in New Zealand, that's how we all learnt, by, getting up and playing with bands and being encouraged to do that. So, yeah, I did notice that was a big difference.
And I'm thinking too, like when you first joined Dragon, Neil Storey's drumming parts, like how did you go about learning those? Did you already know them, or did they have them on a cassette for you to learn? Like how'd you go about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. They'd had This Time recorded, which Neil played on just before he died. And so, I listened to that. That had just been released. And that's why there's only 4 members in that film clip, by the way. I suppose you know that. Yeah, Neil had actually gone when that was released. And that was their first release. I think that might have been CBS too. I'm not sure. I can't remember if they were involved at that point. I actually can't remember. I think we just jammed along in a rehearsal studio and I just added my flavour. I think I just learnt the songs that way. I don't think there was anything down on tape. Things weren't really learnt that way and recorded. We're going back to cassettes had just been kind of released, really. Not long before that. So yeah, I think it was just learn as you go, and I just applied my thing, what I do.
Yeah. Prior to recording the Sunshine album, though, those pre-Fame and Fortune days, as you said, like what were those gigs like? Like you mentioned, I think a little bit about like kind of the places you played, but do you have any memories about like those actual gigs playing with them, like for the first kind of time?
Yeah, the first kind of time it was just pubs in Bondi. I don't remember a lot of them. It was so long ago, Jack, but I do remember, I don't remember the name of it, a hotel in Bondi, and it was just a hotel, and there weren't a lot of people around, but it was just, I think the difference with that era was, compared to now, was that there were bands playing everywhere, every night, all the time, and even right through the 70s and right through the 80s, you could be working every night of the week, or you'd be going on the road for 6 months, and doing gigs every week, and sometimes doing 3 gigs a day. You do a pub at 8 p.m. and then you do a high school that day at lunchtime, and then you do a 2 a.m. or at an all-night nightclub. But to answer your question about gigs, I don't really, recall them in detail. I just remember we were just working all the time.
Yeah, okay.
And they were small gigs. They were pubs. They weren't theatres and things like that. Not at that point anyway.
Of course, the first single to feature you was Get That Jive, and I did some research and I listened to interviews of other guys in the group, and I heard that like they weren't like, and this is like Todd Hunter and Robert Taylor, they kind of said, oh, we're not really the biggest fan of that song. I think it's because it has that do-up, do-do, like, they're not a fan of that part. Yeah. What did you think of the song at the time? Yeah.
I think, to be honest, sitting here today, it's probably one of my most unfavourite Dragon songs. I don't think I ever really liked it much, but it was weird because it was like our first kind of mild hit, I think, from memory. You probably know better than me. Yeah, I don't know, and maybe it's I don't really know what it is about it, but I had many more favourite songs, and particularly to play, than that one.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, right. Look, you mentioned a little bit before when you kind of started recording the Sunshine album, and I was listening to the album, and there's a particular song on there called On the Beachhead, I think it's called, and I was just listening to that, and why I bring that up is it sounds like, how were your drums mic'd in the studio? Because it sounds like the really crisp sound to the drums on that track. and to the album as a whole?
Yeah, you know what, Jack? I actually don't know. I can't remember because at that stage in my career, I wasn't really into that process of things. I was just playing drums. That came a lot later for me. Of course, I'm right into that nowadays with recording and miking and foldback and everything else. But I think it would have been, Peter Dawkins had an unusual technique. There was one thing he did on my snare drum. I remember he put tape on my snare wires on the snare drum so that the wire cradle that sits underneath the snare drum that you flick on, it gives it that snarey sound. He taped it down because it was rattling, but I thought that was odd because it just gave it a flat sound, and of course the wires didn't rattle anymore, so it didn't sound like a snare drum, it sounded like a box. That was an unusual thing. I don't know why he did that, and I think I took that off because I didn't like it. But I think from memory it was probably just normal. I think they used to use particular tom mics, and they were the long black Shaw mics, I think, on the toms. The snare would have been, I think, mic'd on the top and the bottom. It would have just been the usual that they do today, but and it was, of course, it was recorded at Albert's in Sydney, so it was a pretty well known and used studio. So they would have had okay mics and things like that. But yeah, from what I remember, it would have been fairly standard for the time.
And of course, you being a new member, I mean, do you remember that the recording of the Sunshine album being like did you feel at home, like already in the group, like recording that album? Yeah,
I did. Yeah, definitely. I remember a lot of the songs went down pretty quickly. Yeah, I think it was, for me, it was such a new experience, and not being experienced in studios and not really knowing what was going on. It was just go in, play the drum track, and then, go and have lunch or whatever it was. We did. It was kind of in, do the track, out, have a break, in, do another track.
You mentioned, some of the recording process there, and I'm thinking, do you look back on those days, with the old, tape machines, analog recording fondly, or, how do you remember those days? Yeah.
Yeah, I do, and I still do. I still think tape is a great medium. I do remember back in the days of the Sunshine album and the Running Free album, and going down to 2-inch tape, and I remember the engineers, if there was an area that didn't quite work, they'd slice it with a blade and kind of rejoin it together with tape. I don't know how that worked. That's what they used to do. It's incredible when you think about it. Yeah, fond memories of all that. And I mean, I know that there are studios around that still have tape available. There's one up here in Brisbane called Lush Studios, actually, which still have 2-inch tape available. It's very expensive. That's the only trouble nowadays. If you want to buy a reel of it, and you can't put a lot of information, it doesn't go for that long. But I'm a big fan of 2-inch tape still.
Again, listening to the album, and I know you talked a bit about your background with the funk music, and I was listening to tracks like Blacktown Boogie and Street Between Your Feet. I think they have a very funky kind of disco flavour to them, and that kind of makes me think, I know you had a background with a bit of funk music in your life, but I mean, was that what you guys were inspired by, making those some of those tracks on there, because I mean, disco and funk was pretty popular in the mid-70s.
I think I don't think so. I think a lot of the writing came from Paul Hewson, so it was very the piano player. So he wrote most of those hits, or co-wrote most of those hits. Marc wrote a lot of lyrics as well, but we were. I think the idea was that we were commercially or pop orientated. We wanted to be commercially successful. So the funk thing for the rest of the band didn't really come into it. I think maybe my background maybe added that. And I remember when we did the second album, we did April Sun In Cuba, I took a rough mix of that cassette somewhere for someone to listen to after we'd done it. And I knew that was going to be a hit just by the sound of it. Todd's bass line kind of goes ga-gung, gung, 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 ga-gung, gung. It's kind of like that riff, right? And even nowadays, I heard a lot of drummers playing that riff on their bass drum. Boom, 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 boom. But it's actually, I said to the guys when we were recording it, why don't we just do it 4 on the floor bass drum? Boom, boom, because of the disco thing that was huge at the time. And it seemed to just nail that groove down. And I think that's what I added to the group, was that little sense of difference, that different kind of approach and different sound, which is maybe why it worked. I don't know. But yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, how was the success of the Sunshine album for you guys? Because I mean, that was kind of like the band's first kind of experience of fame. I mean, what was that like for you? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It was. I mean, I remember back in those times, flying was very expensive, so none of the bands flew. Everyone drove, overnighters, Sydney to Melbourne, Melbourne to Adelaide, Sydney to Brisbane, whatever. We'd all pile into the old Chrysler Valiant and off we'd go. It was exciting, but it was definitely the lead up to, more gigs, more well known, and I suppose that was the time when things took off for us, particularly gig-wise. We were doing bigger gigs, more gigs, and then, of course, when the second album came out, and, of course, April Sun In Cuba, that was kind of, I suppose, the bombshell. That was the one that really took off.
I think you're talking about the bass line in April Sun In Cuba, and I'm kind of just thinking, do you remember hearing that, like, for the first time, like when Marc Hunter or Paul Houston kind of presented it to the group?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were rehearsing it, putting it together as a band, and we were renting a house out in Church Point in Sydney, which is Northern Beaches. So we were all living together, and then we get up in the morning and have breakfast, then we go down and we'd rehearse in the big room downstairs. We'd have our gear set up and we just rehearsed, and that's how we learned our songs, and that's how we wrote the songs, or how the band wrote the songs. And I remember then when we were rehearsing the song, that's when I wanted to change the bass drum part, because I just heard it, and I suppose I was thinking, listen, this could be more of a dance track if we just add that bass drum. No one seemed to have a problem with it, so we just did it that way. I was thinking quite often too with bass players and drum parts, you often don't want to follow the bass player. You want to give the bass player a bit of room to move around and lay some cement down for him. Not always, but often.
Yeah, I mean, did it take long for the song to kind of go from start to finish, like in terms of the writing process? Yeah,
I remember that most of the time Paul and Marc and Robert was writing then too. I think Todd a little bit too, but most of the songs were written when we came to rehearse them. There might have been some jigging around here and there, but for example, there's a song on the third album, Ozambezi, called Midnight Groovies. And I remember we had a lunch break after recording a couple of the tracks, and while we were out getting sandwiches or whatever, Paul and Marc wrote that song in like half an hour, and we recorded it when we got back. And it's funny, it's one song we never played live. From my memory, a lot of those songs were already written and when we came to rehearse them.
Okay, and I'm just thinking too, like when you recorded April Sun In Cuba, did you guys, when you recorded that song, did you do like a basic like track with all you guys in one room live and then add stuff over it? Like how did that work? Yeah.
No, it always worked where the drums were isolated, because you can't have bleed into the mics, vocal mics and things like that. So drums are isolated in their own booth and mic'd up, and drummers wear headphones. And then the guitar player, often the guitar player, keyboard player and bass player would be in the same room, but they'd be DI'd. They wouldn't have amps, or their amps would be, not DI'd, the keyboard player might be DI'd, but their amps would be in separate booths. So everything's kind of soundproof from each other, because you can't have bleed into... then we have Marc would be doing guide vocals in another room, so they'd all be isolated. And then, of course, so we get the rhythm beds down, or the main guts of the track, and then we'd possibly put overdubs on after that, and then put the final lead vocal on, or that might go the other way around. Usually the lead vocals go on separately at the end, and BVs and things like that, backing vocals.
When you kind of had finished that song, at what point did you know that did you know it was going to become like an Australian icon, like at all?
Not so much an Australian icon, no. I still struggle with that a bit nowadays because it's still being played. But no, there was something, I don't know, I've always been able to pick, more often than not anyway, songs that are going to do well or be commercially viable or that people are going to grab onto. And I just had a feeling about that song. I didn't know it was going to be as long-lasting, definitely, as it is now.
I mean, that must be an amazing thing for you, given how, you played on that track, you were part of the process of its writing, and, that came out in 77, I think it was. I mean, and to have it still being played on the radio, in 2023, I mean, that must be a pretty amazing thing for you to just hear it, and yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks, mate. Yeah, it is special, I suppose. I can think back and think, that's pretty special that song is still around. But yeah, it gives a nice feeling, particularly walking into a supermarket and here I am buying milk and April Sun In Cuba comes on. Sometimes you have to pinch yourself.
I can imagine. And I was looking at the album cover of the album that April Sun In Cuba is off, Running Free, and I think you're on the far left of the album cover. And
cigarette. hanging out my mouth or in my hand or something like that.
Yeah, and you've got this, you've got like great 70s fashion. You've got this great big head of hair, and if I've got this right, and you've got like these big collars. I mean, do you miss the fashion from that time? Like, yeah.
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. Yes and no. Do I miss it? I don't know. It was a lot of that came from Marc. He was just so outlandish and didn't really give a flying rat's about anything. He just did what he wanted to do, and a lot of that came from him. But yeah, I suppose I miss it. I think a lot of it was over the top, though. The big collars and the shirt open to your navel and all that sort of thing. And but the tight jeans and all that. I mean, I suppose all that's come back in a way too. And the scarves. But yeah, there's something about that era that I'll always miss, and just I think more so the whole scene, and the whole music scene's so different now. You know, it was so free and open and work everywhere and back in those days, and I think the young bands and the kids musicians nowadays, it's a whole different scene. Their scene's different, and it's good. It can work for them, but it's I think they've missed out on a lot of the fun aspect of it, and a lot of the fun, probably the wrong word, but I think you know where I'm going.
And something that I was kind of thinking about, there was one track off Running Free that I was listening to. I think it was called Any Fool Can Tell You. And I was yeah. And I was listening to it because it kind of has like a Chuck Berry kind of flavour to it. And that kind of made me think, like, at that point in 1977, looking back on those artists of like the late 50s, early 60s, I mean, of course now we all view those guys as legends, but at that point in 77, were they looked on as legends, or were they kind of looked on as has-beens by that point? I was just thinking like that kind of perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure, and I think, from memory, and correct me if I'm wrong because I don't have the album in front of me, but I think that's a Robert Taylor song, and I know Robert was really, and probably still is to this day, influenced by the blues and jazz, like myself. And so that's probably the answer to the question. I don't think they were has-beens then or anything like that. I think that was just an influence Robert had, and he wrote that song with that influence inside him.
Well, the next album, Ozambezi, came out, and I mean, listening to that, I mean, it sounds like you guys are really inspired. I mean, that would be for me the best Dragon album from my perspective. I mean, were you guys really really inspired musically at that point?
I think so, yeah, and I think, Todd had a lot of involvement in the songwriting at that point as well. It was kind of changing a little bit. It's a good question. There were a lot of things happening at that time. At that point, we just finished the album, and Are You Old Enough had been released, but then we took off for our infamous, ill-fated tour of the US at that same point. It was just before Christmas, 79, whatever it was, I think it was 79. And of course, that was a complete disaster. But when we came back, Are You Old Enough was number one. And so we did another tour. But then it was shortly after that the band broke up. I think Marc left the band. I think Todd sacked Marc, something like that. And then we had 2 years off before we reformed again with a different lineup. And then just before Marc came back to the band. But I would suppose you could say we were probably at our peak then. And then we started to go downhill as a band. There were, it just started to fall apart. And particularly, Todd and Marc were fighting because they're brothers, had different headspaces and different ideas. And I think in the end, Todd he broke the band up basically, sacked Marc, got a new lineup together, which you're probably aware of, with Billy Miller and the violinist. It was a bit of a weird concept. We did one album and then that fell apart. And then we had that 2-year hiatus and then came back together in 82. To do the class reunion tour, and that's when we recorded Rain, and that was the last thing I did, the tour for that and that song. Going back to Ozambezi, it was a critical album, I suppose, and there were good tracks on it, and a lot of different styles of writing as well, apart from Are You Old Enough, which was pretty pop, a lot of different styles, but yeah, and then it kind of came to an end.
Of course, Are You Old Enough, I think, as you mentioned, when you got back from America, I think that was your band's only number one hit in Australia. I mean, they had, and I think April Sun only went to number 2 or something like that, but this was their...
It did.
Yeah.
Thanks to Mull of Kintyre. Yeah, Mull of Kintyre was number 1 for about 6 months or something ridiculous.
Yeah. Do you remember being told, because I mean, number 1, that's pretty big. I mean, do you remember being told you'd gone to number 1 for the first time? Like, do you remember that at all?
Yeah, I do, because we'd got back, we'd just gotten back, and it was just pre-Christmas. I think it was just about to be Christmas. I don't remember the exact date, but it was around that time when everyone was on holiday and everyone had everything was quiet. And I remember, number 1. And then, apart from that, I don't remember much else, but I mean, obviously we would have been doing some gigs after that. But we did break up in that 1980, just around 1980. I do recall that too. And just after the second lineup was a kind of a failure.
Peter Dawkins, longtime producer of the band, and I was kind of thinking, like, would you say it's fair to kind of say he was like the de facto seventh Dragon? I think there were 6 of you at the time. I mean, would you call him the de facto seventh Dragon?
I suppose in a sense I'd probably call Sebastian Chase the seventh Dragon. He was our manager who took us from nothing to where we went. I would say, Peter was involved in a big way, but I wouldn't say he was the seventh Dragon. He was just the producer. I think Sebastian we had more of an affinity with as a person. And I'm being kind. I'm not being nasty.
No.
But Peter, I wouldn't say he was part of the family.
And of course, I mean, you mentioned the US tour there and how that song was number 1 after you came back. And I mean, do you remember much about that US tour? I mean, that was a pretty full-on tour from what I've kind of read. I mean, take me through that. Yeah.
Well, I remember the first gig. It was the Armadillo Club, and it was in Texas. It was kind of like if you imagine the Blues Brothers and that bar they played in with the chicken wire in front of the stage. It was like that, but it didn't have chicken wire.
Oh, no.
And we're in there and we're doing our first gig, and the record company there on the side of the stage, and everyone's excited, and we do our first few tunes, and then Mark decides to get up in a crucifix position in front of his mic and call John Wayne a faggot. Sorry I mentioned that word on radio.
No, that's all right.
But that's what happened. So suddenly we had beer cans pelted at us, and we had to basically run for our lives. And I remember use my cymbals as a shield, and to get off stage, it was like crazy. And apparently the record company guys were taking bets as to who was going to get shot first. It was pretty serious.
Yeah,
it's all documented. It's all over the internet, that episode, and it's a true story. To this day, I don't know why he did it. From then on, it was just downhill. The record company, and plus, I suppose that tour was it was a complete mismatch of bands. We were put on a tour with Johnny Winter, which was at that point a 3-piece blues band, and we were just this little white pop band from Australia, and it was just a complete mismatch. So it wasn't going to work anyway. But yeah, I will never forget that episode.
No.
In the Armadillo Club.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned there, like, there was a bit of a mismatch there. I mean, had you guys have had maybe a better tour plan or whatever it was, do you think you guys could have really made it big in America? Like, do you think that was on the cards at all? Like in any?
Well, I think it's a possibility. It could have happened. I think it was just bad planning by Portrait Records. They were the subsidiary company to CBS in the US. They were the company that signed. I think they released that album anyway. And I think we could have had a chance if it was set up differently, and we were doing different gigs or gigs with a band that we were more in line with. Definitely.
Of course, we spoke about that US tour, and I think Mark left soon after, or he got fired, or whatever happened. But I mean, of course, Power Play, next record after that, and
Power Play, that's right.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, like, because I mean, Mark, was such an important part up to that point, of the band. I mean, to not have him a part of that recording process and on the record. I mean, how was that for you guys? Like going through the recording process, the writing process without Mark?
It was, from my memory, it was all Todd's idea. It was something he wanted to try, be a little different, and we thought, well, we already had a name, let's give it a go. As we went, and it didn't last long, but as we went, I just knew in my heart it was going to be a complete disaster, and of course it was. And in the end, it failed. It broke up. We got Mark back again.
Yeah. And
boom, off we went. It was almost like revitalised. The revitalised version. And then, of course, that's how Rain came about in that album, Body and the Beat, eventually. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just going to bring that up too, because I was thinking, I listened to all the things you played on with Dragon and, Power Play, obviously not as inspired as the previous record. And then you get to Rain, it's like, I think that's an amazing thing because, I mean, Rain, relative to the group's like earlier work, it sounds like they've completely embraced a new sound almost. And I think, like, what was that?
It was.
Yeah, how did you... Because, I mean, that's not always easy to do for bands. I mean, some bands try and they fall flat on their face, but Dragon obviously didn't. I mean, they did it fantastically. I mean, what was the process for you guys in getting a new sound and getting this record Rain out there?
I think that the difference with that album was getting Alan Mansfield involved as a producer. And Alan came from the US. He was Robert Palmer's producer. He came in, and Rhinoceros Studios was pretty new at that stage in Sydney, so it all new state-of-the-art equipment for the time. Still tape. We recorded it there, but he gave us a whole new sound. It was big, bold, American, I suppose. And it was a sound that we always felt we were lacking from the previous albums. Not that I'm putting those albums down, but Peter Dawkins didn't produce the same way as Alan did. I think Alan gave us this huge in-your-face sound, even the drums, everything different. So I think the songwriting didn't really, I suppose the songwriting changed as well, but I think it's more the sound of that song that changed more than anything from the previous albums. If you put them both together, you'll know what I mean.
I mean, had recording changed, like in terms of the process of recording, had it changed very much? I mean, I think Rain came out in 82, maybe 83, 82, 83.
83.
82, yeah. Had the recording process changed very much from like 76 to 82, or was it still pretty much the same?
I think it was pretty much the same. Now, I wasn't into recording processes still at that stage, not like I am now, but I think it's still pretty much the same. It was just a new studio and probably had some incredible Neve or SSL desk or something like that, 32 channel or whatever it was. It was just a new studio, probably a good room to record drums in. That's always really important. Acoustically, drums are always the hardest to record. You have to spend the most time on them because they're an acoustic instrument. You can't be in a bad room or you're going to pick up all these bad harmonics and reverbs and all sorts of horribleness if it's not engineered properly. And I think maybe that's what Rhinoceros was as well. At the end of the day, all these things boil down to the guy that's recording it, as well as the band, of course. But you've always got to have those two elements, or three elements really, the engineer, the producer and the band and the studio.
That song was a massive hit in Australia. I mean, that must have been good for you, at least when you did leaving on, at least musically on a high end, on a high note kind of thing.
Yeah, I suppose so, Jack. Yeah, I don't really think about it much, but I suppose. I mean, the whole thing for me was we'd been touring constantly for 10 years, whatever it was, and I personally was exhausted, and I just had to get out, and I just wanted a change as well. I sort of wanted a change in musical direction and style, and I always found as a drummer, wanting to keep myself fresh, sometimes you can get stale. And so, because I have those jazz roots and all these different styles that I've grown up with and performed as, I wanted to change. And that's what I did. So I didn't really think about it too much, the way you just put it, but that's what happened. But yeah, listening to what you just said, I suppose it was a good point to leave, on a high, I suppose, on a high note rather than everything's horrible and everything's gone down and it's stuffed, I suppose, yeah.
After Dragon, you did a lot of session work in the 80s and recorded albums such as Dark Spaces by Richard Clapton, Big City Talk by Marc Hunter.
I got back with Mark and did some recording again. That was fun. There's one track on that Big City Talk album that young Johnny Annis, the drummer, I think he was playing in Mark's band at the time, but he came from Kevin Borich Express, who I don't think he performs much anymore, but we played like double drums on one of those tracks. Can't remember what the track's called, but it's on there, and you'll see it if you're keen to have a look. Yeah, it's kind of like a shuffle, go, that kind of thing. So yeah, it was an interesting time. And I don't remember who produced it either. But yeah, I did a bunch of stuff like that. And then ended up leaving Sydney. I think I did my last gig in a Sydney band, which was Marsha Hines, at the 88 Expo in Brisbane. Went back to Sydney, and I'd really kind of had enough of Sydney. I'd really kind of outgrown it, or it had outgrown me. It had changed. It had certainly changed. It wasn't the 70s and 80s anymore. I was really interested in getting some education in music theory, and so I applied to go to the conservatorium here in Brisbane, and got into that and ended up doing the jazz course there. So I did an arranging course and some piano, which I had also played a little bit of when I was a kid, and drums, and graduated there and decided to stay here and started gigging around here. And then eventually I hooked up with Kevin Borich again, who I'd played with in the 80s in that 2-year split from Dragon. 80 to 82, I played with Kevin. So I got back with Kevin, did a tour. And then I ended up getting a call from my old mate Ian Moss. He was about to do a tour of Germany. So I did that, and then I've kind of been with him ever since. Just loved it up here. So relocated. Basically, I've been here since 1990, really.
You mentioned a bit about Ian Moss there, and of course, more recently, you formed the Filthy Animals during the COVID lockdowns. I mean, how did that? How did that all come to be? Yeah.
Well, it came about because of the COVID lockdown, and nobody could travel across the border. Nobody could do any gigs, and we thought, let's. I have a partner who had this great idea, and she said, "Look, why don't you form a band, kind of like a cover band, rock classics." Kind of like a Party Boys idea, I suppose, of musicians you know up here. And that's what I did. Found Brett Williams from the Choir Boys, and Lee Novak from Savage Garden, and OJ Newcomb from John Butler, and a number of other players. It was a bit of a throwaway idea. Anyway, we got it together, and we've been together nearly 2 years now, and it's been going gangbusters. It's just a good fun idea, get out and play again. But it was supposed to be just while the borders were closed, and a rotational lineup, because we all still have our other bands we play in now. And so that's what it's become, and it's been going gangbusters. Yeah. So the Filthy Animals, we're looking at bringing that interstate as well. We've done a couple of things in South Australia, but certainly going to be looking at doing more now that everyone can travel again, and it's a lot of fun.
And I've been looking at the YouTube for the Filthy Animals too, and you guys got some great videos on there, like really good quality, like really well filmed stuff. I mean, is that
the Filthy TV?
What sparked that idea, and how did that come to be? Like, it's just amazing stuff. Yeah.
Well, it's all come from my partner, who's now our manager, and she comes from a media background, and she's just full of these amazing ideas. All of our social media and promo and art design and logo and band name, it's all come from her. So it was just another idea she had. I think the best one was the one at the Triffid, which is the one we had Mossy guest for. It's all about, we find an artist, what songs you want to sing, and he loves Bad Company, so we did some Bad Company songs, and that's how it kind of worked. And then all the other singers do, and that one was British, Best of British Rock, so all the other artists we had would pick their favourite British band, like The Police or something like that, etc., etc.
That's a fantastic, concept, I think. And, I mean, have you got any...
Yeah, thanks, Jack.
Yeah, I just think, because it's unique, it's not like a lot of bands don't do that. I mean, so yeah, I think definitely, if anyone out there wants to see the Filthy Animals, I mean, where are you guys playing? Are you? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. We're doing mainly Queensland shows at the moment. The whole concept of the band's a little bit different. I mean, there are 1,000,001 tribute bands around, but we feel it's a little bit different, because not only are we doing songs from great rock bands, but we're also doing songs from our own bands. So we do some Dragon songs, we do some Choir Boys songs, we do a John Butler song, we do a Savage Garden song, etc. Because the players in this band have played on those tracks, or played in those bands, or play in those bands. And so it's a little bit different. Like I said, it's got a different kind of concept. It's not really a tribute band. And the venues we play at up here, I suppose we do clubs, some festivals we've done, and we're kind of lining up to do more of that, and it's actually growing as we speak, to be honest. It's going really well.
Yeah, would you guys ever do an album or a CD of your stuff live, or original stuff? Have you thought about that yet?
Yeah, we have thought about it, and it's interesting you say that, but yeah, there are ideas floating around, and there are things in the pipeline. So if you're obviously aware of our website or our socials page, so keep your eye on it, Jack, and there are things coming.
All right, we'll do. Well, Kerry, I think it's just been such a great conversation we've had today, and
thanks, Jack. You too, mate, and really good questions. I'm glad I could remember most of it, because there are a lot of hazy times from that era, of course, because it was just what can I say? It was full on.
That was the former drummer of Dragon, Kerry Jacobson. Kerry left Dragon in 1983 and so no longer plays with the band, but you can check out Kerry's new band called The Filthy Animals at filthyanimals.com.au. Remember to share this episode with other music fans, and if you really enjoyed this edition, let us know. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Vinyl Vibes, and to all you music lovers out there, stay groovy.